The FIA president has opened a request for new teams to be able to apply to enter Formula One. Some teams have expressed their interest already, and it seems like major brands will have priority. So is this a sign that independent teams are not welcome in Formula One anymore? Let's have a look. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. The new teams. The most prominent and vocal team that has expressed an intention to join the sport in the last couple of years is Andretti. The famous name in the world of motorsport has been associated with Formula One for a while, and they've even publicly stated that they have the required $200 million new team dilution fee to go to their new competitors. Andretti Global has announced their intention to join the sport once again following Ben Sulayem's announcement, and this time they've partnered with Cadillac to support their entry, ensuring that a new major American car manufacturer would also be joining the grid, and one with an impressive motorsport pedigree. To me, this partnership increases the credibility of the entry and would surely increase the interest of fans, and this addition would build on the sport's expansion into the American market. Plus, major, well-known manufacturer-backed teams bring more to Formula One than independent teams without much history or a dedicated fan base. But despite the clear interest from the FIA president and many Formula One fans, the F1 website itself didn't cover it at all, despite almost every other news outlet picking up the story. There was radio silence from Formula One representatives, which implies that they and the existing F1 teams have little interest in the Andretti-Cadillac partnership. So there seems to be a rift between the FIA president and Formula One, which seems like it could be problematic in the coming season. It's been reported that the F1 teams themselves are also against the introduction of a new team to the grid, despite the fact that they would all be set to receive an equal split of the $200 million anti-dilution fee. The reason for this is the fact that the $20 million they'd each receive might not be enough to cover the potential long-term losses from having another competitor on the grid. But in my opinion, a sport in which the teams competing have significant influence over who can and can't join the competition feels wrong. Cadillac and Andretti are not the only team with an interest in joining the grid though, with several independent entries also expressing their interest. Panthera Team Asia was the most vocal team looking to join the grid before the Andretti interest, with the setup promoting themselves as the Team of Asia. There's been more noise from this group since the announcement from the FIA president, and so it looks like there is interest here. As ever though, there are plenty of rumours going around highlighting some other potential new joiners to the F1 grid, the majority of which are independent teams and not necessarily backed by major car manufacturers. And this is where there's an increasing challenge for Formula One, as if there's a desire to fill the remaining two team entries into the sport, then there's likely to be more interest in known brands rather than unknown entities. The challenge for independence. The F1 grid currently has 6 teams that are also car manufacturers themselves or supported by car manufacturers. Of the remaining 4, Red Bull and AlphaTauri are supported by Honda from a power unit perspective and are the only teams to have that backing. And that leaves us with Haas and Williams as the 2 teams that are customers for engines and not supported by car brands. This is a shift when you look at the history of the sport, with many independent and self-owned teams existing just to go racing. In 2023, it seems very difficult to thrive in Formula One anyway, let alone as an independent. The 2 teams of Haas and Williams are both backed by larger organisations, and you could argue that the purchase of Williams in 2020 by Doralton Capital was the end of the true independent teams of Formula One. However, even looking at these 2 semi-independent teams, they seem to be in some of the worst positions of all the setups on the grid right now. Whilst the team principals seem to have had their own silly season in December, the one team in the sport that was left without a named boss at the start of this year was Williams. Jost Capito left the team after 2 years at the top, and the comments from the team were focused on the rebuild and transformation process and thanking Capito for postponing his retirement. However, it must be said that usually with a planned exit, the team would have had the chance to find an adequate replacement to announce soon after the departure. It took until this week for the team to announce that they've secured the services of James Vowles, the former strategy lead at Mercedes. This is a great hire, but it feels rushed given he's joining in February, which builds on the theory that the team were caught off guard by Capito's departure. Williams had a poor 2022 season, and the team principal that's been so successful in rallying in the past has now gone as well. It implies that the direction that the team is going in from a management perspective wasn't what Capito expected or believed in. So one of the few semi-independent teams left on the grid seems to be struggling to find a level of stability needed to succeed, and that isn't good for them or the sport as a whole. As for Haas, well, they've spent 2 years looking ahead at the new regulations rather than backing the car that they've got and trying to develop and improve it. This decision has been made due to previous funding constraints, which may be resolved thanks to the new MoneyGram title sponsor backing. However, it's a difficult cycle to break. The team will want to perform well, but unless they have a solid starting point as they did last year, they'll always have a tendency to revert back to their old ways and just focus on the future. What this approach does is increase the interest around the team and arguably the value of the team to potential investors. If the Haas team can say that they've spent more time and effort on developing future cars, they'll have more external interest. So again, like Williams, it feels like Haas is a long way from making steps up the order. Back in 2010, when Formula 1 last opened the door to potential entrants, 4 teams were given the green light to enter the sport. These teams were lured in by the promise of a budget cap, something that now does exist in the sport. Ultimately, of the 3 that actually made it to the races in 2010, each had left the sport in their various guises within 6 seasons. So it is understandable that the sport is apprehensive about opening the door to new teams once again. How many teams is the right number of teams? I asked this question a couple of years ago on Behind the Drive, and it seems like the majority of F1 fans want a full roster of 12 teams and 24 cars on the F1 grid. Given the anti-dilution fee, each of the current teams is valued at a minimum of 200 million, plus their assets. So I think it's unlikely that any team will go bankrupt or exit the sport in the foreseeable future. So on the assumption that these final 2 spots could well not open up again in the future, with any team with an interest in joining beyond 2026 potentially being forced to buy out an existing setup, the decision of who gets the positions on the grid this time around is one that the FIA and Formula 1 needs to get right first time. The tension between these 2 entities is a fascinating situation. Mohammed bin Sulayem has been vocal about his disappointment that there hasn't been more enthusiasm for the teams joining the grid, and from a fan's perspective, I can see exactly why that's the case. We want to see more teams on the grid, and the Andretti-Cadillac partnership does potentially seem to be a formidable setup. But there are clear reasons why the other teams won't want the new additions to the grid, and why Formula 1 itself is right to be apprehensive about opening the door. By increasing securing the value of teams in Formula 1, the motivation to introduce purely independent teams into the sports seems to have gone. So for me, I think that the financial regulations recently introduced to the sport have fundamentally changed the landscape and the future. Let me know if you'd like to see independent entries into the sport in the future, and if you like the video, then there's a button specifically for that. And while you're there, do consider subscribing as well.